While working as a waitress in a luxury restaurant, the woman froze when she saw that the millionaire customer was her husband, who had died 7 years ago. She approached, and the restaurant buzzed with the kind of energy only the wealthy could create. A soft hum of expensive conversations, punctuated by the occasional clink of crystal glasses. Emily adjusted her apron, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face as she moved toward table 12, her feet aching from another double shift. Working at L'Exquisite, the city's most elite dining spot, had its perks, but it wasn't glamorous. She was invisible to the glittering clientele, and that suited her just fine. Until tonight, her heart sank as she glanced at the reservation note. Private guest. No details shared. She hated these vague instructions. It usually meant a demanding customer with a taste for secrecy. Sighing, she grabbed her notepad and tray and headed to the dimly lit corner where table 12 awaited. When she arrived, her steps faltered. Seated there, impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, was a man she would recognize anywhere. His profile, the way he sipped his wine, the subtle tilt of his head, it all screamed Michael, her Michael, the man she'd buried 7 years ago. Emily froze, her fingers tightening around the tray until it bit into her skin. Her mind raced. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be him. Yet there he was, alive, elegant, and very much at ease in a world so far removed from the modest life they had built together. The Michael she knew loved t-shirts and baseball games, not cufflinks and silk ties. Beside him sat a striking woman, her beauty sharp and polished like a diamond. She laughed softly at something Michael said, her hand brushing his arm. Emily felt a sharp pang of jealousy and confusion, followed by anger. "Miss," the man's voice startled her. Michael, if it really was him, was looking at her now, straight into her eyes. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, something almost imperceptible. Recognition, panic, but then it was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar coldness. "Yes." Emily's voice came out strained. She hoped they couldn't hear the tremor in it. "I believe you're here to take our order," he said, his tone clipped and formal. He didn't flinch, didn't falter. He acted like she was a stranger, a random waitress. Emily blinked, her chest tightening. "Yes, of course, my apologies," she managed, forcing her voice to steady. She scribbled down their orders mechanically, the words blurring on the page. Every fiber of her being wanted to scream at him, to grab his shoulders and demand answers. But she didn't. Not here. Not now. As she walked away, her legs felt like jelly. She ducked into the kitchen, leaning against the counter to catch her breath. Her co-worker, Jenna, shot her a concerned look. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily let out a shaky laugh. "Maybe I have." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "Spill, what happened?" Emily hesitated, glancing around the bustling kitchen. "It's nothing, just a long night." But it wasn't nothing. Her thoughts spiraled as she tried to focus on her other tables, but her eyes kept drifting toward table 12. Michael, alive, the man she had mourned, cried over, and tried to let go of, the man who had left her to raise their son alone. The sight of him, so alive and vibrant, filled her with equal parts relief and rage. How dare he? The last time she had seen him was in a closed casket. After the horrific car crash that had taken his life, she could still remember the numbness, the endless condolences, and the unbearable weight of trying to hold it all together for their then 6-month-old baby. And now he was here, laughing with another woman, as if none of it had ever happened. When table 12 finally left, Emily couldn't resist following them, her heart pounding in her chest. She slipped out of the back entrance, staying in the shadows as Michael and the woman climbed into a sleek black car. The man she once called her husband held the door open for the woman with a gallantry that seemed rehearsed, almost practiced. The car's engine roared to life, and as the taillights disappeared into the night, Emily felt her knees weaken. The night air was crisp, but Emily's thoughts burned with questions. How could he do this? How could he leave her to believe he was dead? And who was that woman? She pressed a hand to her chest, as if trying to keep her heart from shattering all over again. When Emily finally returned home to her modest apartment, she found her son fast asleep, his small frame curled up under a blanket. She leaned against the doorway of his room, watching him breathe, and tears welled in her eyes. How would she explain this to him if it turned out to be true? Back in the living room, Emily sat on the couch holding a worn photo of Michael. It was from their wedding day, both of them smiling, their eyes full of love and hope for the future. "I don't understand," she whispered to the photo. Her voice cracked, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. Why would you do this to us?" The photo, of course, offered no answers, but Emily knew she couldn't let this go. She needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Tomorrow, she decided, the investigation would begin. The morning sun streamed through the curtains of Emily's modest apartment, but the warmth it brought did little to soothe her. She sat at the kitchen table, a mug of untouched coffee in her hands, staring blankly at the wall. Sleep had eluded her. The image of Michael, alive and unbothered, haunted her mind. Every detail replayed: his tailored suit, the way he spoke, the look in his eyes when he saw her. "Mom," the small voice startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. Her 7-year-old son, Ethan, stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes and clutching his favorite stuffed bear. "Good morning, sweetheart," Emily said, forcing a smile. "Did you sleep well?" He nodded, padding over to the table and climbing into a chair. "Can we have pancakes today?" "Of course," she replied, ruffling his hair. Pancakes were his favorite, and she figured the normalcy of their routine might help her push through the turmoil swirling inside her. As she whisked the batter, Ethan chatted about his upcoming day at school. His innocent enthusiasm was a welcome distraction, but the moment he mentioned the father-son event next week, Emily's chest tightened. She had dreaded those events every year, finding excuses or creating diversions to avoid Ethan feeling the absence of a father he never really knew. "Mom, are you listening?" Ethan's voice snapped her back. "Sorry, sweetheart. What did you say?" "I said it's okay if you don't want to come." "I know you're busy." Her heart ached. "No, Ethan, I'll be there, I promise." She kissed the top of his head and tried to hide the tears welling up in her eyes. Dropping him off at school later, Emily lingered a moment longer than usual, watching him run off to join his friends. He waved at her with a bright smile that, for a brief moment, eased the weight on her chest. But the moment passed quickly, and as she drove to the restaurant for her shift, her mind returned to Michael. She needed answers, not just for herself, but for Ethan. During the afternoon lull at L'Exquisite, Emily confided in her best friend and coworker, Rachel. They huddled near the coffee station, their voices low amidst the clatter of dishes. "Emily, you're sure it was him?" Rachel asked, skepticism mingling with concern. "Rachel, I know what I saw," Emily replied firmly. "It was Michael. He's alive and he's different." Rachel sighed, leaning against the counter. "But why would he fake his death? That doesn't make sense." "What about the accident?" "I don't know, but he looked at me, Rachel. He looked right at me, and I swear for a second he recognized me. Then why didn't he say anything?" Emily shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's what I'm going to find out." Rachel hesitated before placing a hand on Emily's arm. "Be careful, okay? If he's alive and hiding something, there's a reason. You have Ethan to think about." The mention of her son made Emily's resolve stronger. "That's exactly why I have to do this. Ethan deserves to know the truth." That evening, Emily sat in her small living room with a notebook spread across her lap. She had spent hours combing through her memories of Michael, trying to piece together any clues she might have overlooked in the past. The accident had been so sudden, so final. The car crash had left no room for questions, or so she thought. She scribbled down everything she remembered. The day of the accident, the funeral, the condolences from friends and family. Something felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her concentration. It was Rachel. "Hey," Emily answered. "I was thinking," Rachel began. "Do you still have those old newspapers from the time of the accident? There might be something there." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "You're right. I still have a box of stuff from back then. I'll check." After hanging up, Emily pulled the box from her closet. It was filled with old photos, letters, and keepsakes from her life with Michael. She hesitated before opening it. Bracing herself for the flood of memories, she found the newspaper quickly, its edges yellowed with time. The headline was burned into her memory, Local man dies in tragic collision. She read through the article carefully, noting the date, the location, and the details of the crash. Something wasn't adding up. The article mentioned a witness, someone who had reportedly seen the accident happen, but the name was unfamiliar to her. Richard Caldwell. Who is Richard Caldwell? She muttered to herself, scribbling the name into her notebook. If someone had seen the crash, why hadn't they come forward to her personally? Later that night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of uncovering something big. The name Richard Caldwell loomed in her mind, a shadowy piece of the puzzle. Who was he? And what did he know about Michael's supposed death? Her thoughts were interrupted by a noise outside her window, a faint creak. Like footsteps on the fire escape, Emily's heart raced as she sat up, straining to listen, but the sound didn't come again. Shaking off her unease, she lay back down, clutching the notebook to her chest like a lifeline. Tomorrow, she would dig deeper. Tomorrow, she would start finding answers. Emily woke the next morning with the same determination she'd felt the night before. She sat at the kitchen table with her notebook, staring at the name she'd written, Richard Caldwell. The name didn't ring any bells, but it was her only lead. If he had been a witness to Michael's supposed death, maybe he could explain what really happened that night. The morning was a blur of routine. She prepared Ethan's breakfast, packed his lunch, and drove him to school, her mind racing with possibilities the entire time. She barely heard Ethan's chatter in the car, offering only distracted nods and murmurs in response. As she watched him run off toward his classroom, she made a silent promise to protect him. No matter where this investigation led, back at home, Emily booted up her old laptop and opened the browser. Her fingers hovering over the keyboard, she typed Richard Caldwell car crash witness into the search bar and hit enter. Dozens of results appeared, but most were unrelated. She scrolled through page after page, frustration building, until she stumbled across a local forum post from years ago. The thread was titled, Remembering the Tragic Accident on Elmwood Drive, and one of the replies caught her eye. I saw it happen that night. I still can't forget it. R. Caldwell. Emily's heart raced as she clicked on the profile. It was mostly empty, with no recent activity, but there was an email address listed, without hesitating. She drafted a message. Hi, Mr. Caldwell. My name is Emily, and I'm reaching out about the accident on Elmwood Drive 7 years ago. I believe you may have witnessed it. I have some questions and would deeply appreciate your help. She hit send, staring at the screen as if willing an immediate response, but the inbox remained stubbornly empty. By early afternoon, Emily was pacing the living room, checking her email every few minutes. When her phone buzzed, she lunged for it, only to see Rachel's name on the screen. Any luck? Rachel asked. I found a post by Richard Caldwell on a forum, Emily said, biting her lip. I emailed him, but no response yet. That's something at least, Rachel replied, her voice encouraging. But, Emily, are you sure you want to go down this road? What if the answers you find only make things worse? Emily sighed. I don't have a choice. I need to know the truth, for Ethan and for myself. I can't keep living with these questions. Rachel hesitated. Just be careful, okay? Let me know if you need backup. Thanks, Rachel. I will. That evening, as Emily started her shift at L'Exquisite, she kept one eye on her phone, hoping for a response from Richard Caldwell. But the hours dragged on, and her inbox remained empty. The weight of her unanswered questions made every interaction with customers feel heavier. As she refilled a glass of wine at one of the tables, her manager approached her, looking stern. Emily, Table 12 requested you specifically tonight, he said. Her heart sank. Table 12. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Michael, seated in the same corner as before. This time he was alone, sipping a glass of red wine and looking every bit as composed as he had the night before. Do you want me to assign someone else? Her manager asked. Noticing her hesitation, Emily forced a smile, though her stomach churned. No, it's fine. I'll take it. As she approached the table, Michael looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of emotion. Regret, perhaps. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Good evening, she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Can I get you started with anything else tonight? Michael studied her for a long moment. then leaned back in his chair. "No, thank you, just the check." Emily nodded and retrieved the bill, placing it on the table with a forced smile. But as she turned to leave, Michael spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the restaurant. Emily froze, her heart pounding. She turned back to him, her fists clenched at her sides. "What do you mean?" Michael didn't answer. Instead, he placed a crisp bill on the table, stood, and walked past her, brushing her shoulder as he left. The cryptic warning lingered in her mind for the rest of the shift, gnawing at her. What did he mean? Why shouldn't she be there? When Emily finally got home that night, exhausted and more confused than ever, she checked her email again. This time, there was a new message waiting for her. Subject: Accident on Elmwood Drive, Emily. I remember the crash vividly. I don't know how I can help, but I'll tell you what I saw. Let's talk. Richard Caldwell. Her breath caught as she read the words. Finally, a crack in the mystery. But before she could respond, a noise outside the window made her pause. It was faint, like footsteps on the fire escape again. She stood frozen for a moment, her pulse racing. But when she peeked through the blinds, there was nothing there. Emily sat back down, her hands trembling as she typed a reply to Richard, agreeing to meet. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but the pull to uncover the truth was stronger than her fear. The next morning, Emily woke up early, her mind buzzing with anticipation and unease. The email from Richard Caldwell had been a breakthrough, but she couldn't ignore the cryptic warning Michael had given her at the restaurant. Every word he'd said, and the coldness in his tone, played on repeat in her head. After dropping Ethan off at school, Emily sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She had agreed to meet Richard at a quiet cafe downtown, and now the time had come. With a deep breath, she started the engine and made her way there, her stomach in knots. The cafe was small and cozy, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside the chaos of the city. Emily spotted Richard immediately. He was an older man with graying hair and a weathered face, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans. His eyes, however, were sharp, darting around the room as if he was constantly assessing his surroundings. "Mr. Caldwell?" Emily asked, approaching his table. He looked up, his expression softening. "You must be Emily, please. Have a seat." She sat down, clasping her hands in her lap to steady them. "Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure if you'd respond." He chuckled dryly. "Not many people ask about something that happened 7 years ago. It's not the kind of memory I like revisiting." "I understand," Emily said, her voice low. "But I need to know what you saw that night. The accident. It involved my husband." Richard's brows furrowed, and he leaned forward. "Your husband, Michael, right? I remember his name from the reports." Emily nodded, her throat tightening. "Yes, he was pronounced dead at the scene." Richard exhaled slowly, glancing around the cafe before speaking. "I was driving home that night. I was on Elmwood Drive, heading south, when I saw the crash. The car was overturned, flames starting to lick the sides. I pulled over to help. But by the time I got close..." He paused, shaking his head. "What?" Emily urged, her voice trembling. "There were 2 men," Richard continued. "One of them was pulling someone from the wreckage, a man who looked badly injured but alive. The other, well, he saw me. And let's just say he made it very clear I wasn't supposed to stick around." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "You're saying someone took Michael from the crash? He didn't die there." Richard nodded grimly. "I'm not sure what happened after that. I drove off. I didn't want any trouble, but it's haunted me ever since. The way they looked. It wasn't an ordinary rescue." Emily's mind raced as she processed his words. "Do you remember anything about the men? What they looked like, or what they were driving?" "One of them was tall, wearing a dark jacket. Couldn't see his face clearly. But his demeanor, he was no good. The other stayed back, didn't say much. They left in a black SUV." A chill ran down Emily's spine. This wasn't just an accident. It was something orchestrated, something deliberate. "Why didn't you tell the police?" she asked. Richard hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. "Because the tall one made it clear that if I talked, I'd regret it. I didn't want to find out what he meant by that." Emily sat back, her head spinning, Everything she thought she knew about Michael's death was unraveling, and the pieces were pointing to something much darker than she'd imagined. Later that day, Emily returned to L'Exquisite for her evening shift, her thoughts consumed by what Richard had told her. She needed to confront Michael. But she didn't know how to find him outside of his cryptic appearances at the restaurant. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. Halfway through her shift, a familiar voice called her name. Emily. She turned sharply, and there he was, Michael standing near the entrance, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to follow him outside. Her heart raced as she followed him to a quiet alley behind the restaurant. The air was thick with tension as they stood facing each other. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to stop," Michael said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Stop asking questions. Stop digging, it's not safe." "Not safe for who?" Emily shot back. "Me, Ethan, or you?" Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might not answer. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "For all of us," he said quietly. "There are people involved in this who wouldn't think twice about hurting you or Ethan to keep their secrets." Emily took a step closer, her anger boiling over. "Secrets? You mean like the fact that you've been alive this whole time? That you let me believe you were dead? Let me bury you?" His eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the cold, distant facade cracked. "Emily, I did what I had to do. You don't understand. Then make me understand," she interrupted. "Tell me the truth, Michael. Why did you leave us? What are you hiding?" He hesitated, looking torn. But before he could answer, the sound of a car engine revving nearby made him tense. He grabbed her arm. "We can't talk here," he said urgently. "I'll find you later, just... Please, Emily, stop digging. For your sake and Ethan's." And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving Emily alone in the alley, her heart pounding and her resolve stronger than ever. Emily sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Michael's words from the alley echoed in her mind. "Stop digging, for your sake and Ethan's." But the warning only fueled her determination. If Michael was trying to scare her off, it meant she was getting closer to the truth. She wasn't going to stop now. After a restless night, Emily knew her next step. She needed to revisit everything about the accident, every detail she'd taken at face value 7 years ago. Michael's funeral, the police report, and even the hospital records. There had to be clues hidden somewhere. Emily started with the funeral home, a modest building on the edge of town where Michael's service had been held. The memories came flooding back as she parked in the gravel lot, standing in the rain, holding Ethan as he cried. The numbness that enveloped her as she said goodbye to the man she thought she'd spent her life with. Inside, the director recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Dawson," he said kindly, his voice soft with sympathy. "It's been a long time, how can I help you?" Emily forced a polite smile, her stomach churning. "I need to ask about my husband's funeral. Michael Dawson. I know this is unusual, but I'm looking for some information." The director hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Of course, I'll see what I can find." He disappeared into the back office, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. When he returned, he held a thin file. "This is everything we have on record," he said, handing it to her. Emily flipped through the papers, her eyes scanning for anything unusual. Then she saw it, a detail she'd never questioned before. The body had been identified through dental records, not a physical viewing. "Why didn't I see him?" she whispered, more to herself than to the director. "You requested a closed casket," he reminded her gently. Given the condition of the body after the crash, it was understandable. She nodded, her mind spinning. At the time, she'd been too grief-stricken to question it. But now, the choice seemed almost too convenient. Had there even been a body at all? Next, Emily visited the police station to request a copy of the crash report. The officer at the desk seemed reluctant, but after a few polite words and a small white lie about needing it for personal closure, he relented. Sitting in her car, Emily pored over the report, searching for inconsistencies. Most of it was standard: location, time of the crash, presumed cause. But one line stood out: under witness statement. The name Richard Caldwell appeared, along with a brief description of his account. Emily's hands shook as she read it. Observed the crash, but left the scene due to fear for personal safety. The report also mentioned another curious detail: a secondary set of tire tracks leading away from the crash site. The notation claimed the tracks were unrelated to the incident, but Emily wasn't convinced. They matched what Richard had told her. Someone had taken Michael from the scene. By the time Emily picked Ethan up from school, her mind was spinning with questions. Ethan, however, was full of energy, talking a mile a minute about his day. "Mom, guess what? I scored a goal in soccer today," he said, beaming with pride. "That's amazing, sweetheart," Emily replied, forcing a smile. She reached back to ruffle his hair. No matter how heavy her thoughts, Ethan's joy was a reminder of what she was fighting for. At home, Ethan settled in with his homework, leaving Emily alone in the living room. She spread out everything she'd gathered so far: the funeral records, the crash report, and her notes from Richard Caldwell. A pattern was starting to emerge, but the pieces weren't fitting together yet. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was Rachel. "Hey, how's the digging going?" Rachel asked. Emily sighed. "I found some things, but nothing concrete yet. Did you know Michael's body was identified through dental records?" "I never actually saw him." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "That's strange. Have you thought about talking to someone who worked on the crash investigation?" "I'm not sure where to start," Emily admitted, "but I'll figure it out." "Be careful," Rachel warned. "It sounds like you're getting close to something big." Later that evening, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak in the apartment and shadow in the corner made her jump. She double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, her paranoia growing by the minute. As she tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mom, why are you so worried?" Emily smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "I'm not worried, sweetheart. Just thinking about work." "You always say that when you're worried," Ethan said with a knowing grin. "It's okay, Mom. I'll protect you." Her heart clenched at his innocence. "You're my brave boy," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Good night, Ethan." As the night stretched on, Emily sat in the dim light of the living room, her mind replaying every detail of her investigation. She knew she was close to uncovering the truth, but the closer she got, the more dangerous it seemed. The memory of Michael's warning lingered in her mind. Stop digging. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when the pieces were finally starting to come together. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine rumbled, and Emily's pulse quickened. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for her next move, and whoever they were, she knew they wouldn't let her uncover the truth without a fight. Emily woke up with a sense of unease that hadn't left her since Michael's cryptic warning. Her investigation was unearthing truths she wasn't sure she was ready for, but she couldn't stop now. If Michael's death had been a lie, then every part of her life since that day had been built on a false foundation. She owed it to herself, and to Ethan, to uncover what really happened. She spent the morning reviewing the crash report again, scanning every line for something she might have missed. The mention of the secondary tire tracks stood out more and more. Whoever had taken Michael from the scene hadn't done so impulsively. It was deliberate, but why? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Emily froze, her heart racing. She wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, she approached, peeking through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his expression calm but unnervingly stern. He didn't look like a neighbor or a delivery driver. Emily hesitated before opening the door a crack. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Mrs. Dawson?" the man asked. His tone was polite, but there was a sharpness beneath it that set Emily on edge. "Yes, I'm here on behalf of a mutual acquaintance," he said, slipping a business card through the gap in the door. Emily took it, her hands trembling slightly. The card was blank except for a name, Victor Moretti. "I don't know who that is," Emily said, trying to sound dismissive. The man smiled faintly, as if he expected her response. "Perhaps not, but I believe you're familiar with someone connected to him, a man named Michael Dawson." Emily's grip on the door tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course," the man said smoothly. "But a word of advice. Curiosity can be dangerous. For you and your son." Emily's stomach dropped. "Is that a threat?" The man tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "It's a friendly warning. Some things are better left in the past, before she could respond. The man turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. Emily closed the door quickly, locking it and leaning against it as her heart pounded. Who was Victor Moretti? And why was someone warning her to stop digging? Later that day, Emily met Rachel at a small diner, hoping for some clarity. She recounted the encounter, her hands shaking around her coffee cup. "This is getting serious," Rachel said, her brow furrowed. "Who do you think this Moretti guy is?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "But if he's connected to Michael, he might have answers. I need to find out more about him." Rachel shook her head. "Emily, this is dangerous. You've already been warned twice. What if next time it's not just a warning?" "I can't stop now, Rachel," Emily said firmly. "Whoever these people are, they've been controlling my life for 7 years without me even knowing. I need to understand why." Rachel sighed, clearly torn. "If you're going to do this, at least don't do it alone. Let me help." "Thanks," Emily said, managing a small smile. "But I need to keep you out of this. It's too risky." Rachel didn't look convinced, but she let it drop for the moment. That evening, Emily put Ethan to bed early, telling him it was because he needed a good night's sleep for his soccer practice the next day. The truth was, she needed time to think, without worrying about him overhearing anything. Once he was asleep, she returned to her laptop, typing "Victor Moretti" into the search bar. The results were immediate and chilling. Moretti was no ordinary businessman. He was a known figure in the criminal underworld, linked to money laundering, extortion, and a string of unsolved disappearances. His name had been whispered in connection with several high-profile crimes, but nothing had ever been proven. Emily stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. If Moretti was involved with Michael, then Michael's disappearance was far more complicated than she'd imagined. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a blocked number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" she said cautiously. There was a pause before a deep, unfamiliar voice spoke. "Mrs. Dawson, you've been asking questions that don't concern you." Emily's breath caught. "Who is this?" "You know who I am," the voice replied. "This is your last chance to walk away. For your son's sake, stay out of this." The line went dead before she could respond. Emily stared at the phone, her hands trembling. The warnings were getting more direct and more personal. The next day, Emily dropped Ethan off at school with a lingering sense of unease. As he waved goodbye and ran toward his friends, she fought the urge to pull him back and keep him close. Instead, she forced herself to smile and drive away. But as she turned the corner, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street from the school. Its windows were tinted, and the engine idled quietly. She couldn't see the driver, but the sight sent a shiver down her spine. She drove past slowly, her stomach twisting with dread. Was it paranoia? Or was someone watching her? Back at home, Emily paced the living room, trying to calm her nerves. The man at her door, the phone call, the SUV. It was all too much. She felt like a cornered animal, unsure of where to turn. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text message from Rachel. "Call me ASAP. I found something." Emily dialed immediately. "Rachel, what's going on?" "I looked up Moretti too," Rachel said, "and I found a connection. He used to own a company called Prometheus Logistics. Guess who was one of their senior employees 7 years ago?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Michael." "Exactly," Rachel confirmed. "Emily, I think Michael didn't just work for Moretti. He might have been involved in something illegal." The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was darker than Emily had imagined. Whatever Michael had gotten himself into, it wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. Emily spent the night tossing and turning, her mind racing with the revelations about Victor Moretti and Michael's possible connection to him. The thought that Michael had been involved with someone so dangerous made her stomach churn. How deep had he been in this mess? And why had he lied to her, abandoned her and Ethan, instead of coming to her for help? By the time the sun rose, Emily felt no closer to answers, only a growing resolve to confront Michael directly. Enough warnings, enough shadows. She needed to hear the truth from him, no matter how painful it was. Later that day, Emily was working her shift at L'Exquisite, the usual din of clinking glasses and murmured conversations serving as background noise. Her thoughts were elsewhere, her mind running through what she would say if Michael appeared again. Would she beg him for answers? Demand them? Could she even trust what he said? Her chance came sooner than expected. Around 8 p.m., as she cleared a table near the back of the restaurant, she spotted him. Michael. He walked in alone, dressed sharply as always and headed straight for the bar. Emily's heart pounded as she watched him. He didn't glance her way or acknowledge her, but she could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't a coincidence. He wanted her to follow him, swallowing her nerves. She put down her tray and whispered to her manager, "I need a quick break." Without waiting for a response, she walked toward the bar, her steps deliberate but cautious. Michael noticed her approach but didn't turn to face her. Instead, he picked up his drink, a neat whiskey, and took a slow sip. "You shouldn't have come back here," Emily said, her voice low but firm. Michael finally turned, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something: guilt, pain, regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I told you to stop," he said quietly. "And I told you I wouldn't," Emily shot back. "Michael, I need answers. You owe me that much." Michael exhaled, setting his glass down. "Not here. Follow me." Emily hesitated, glancing around the room. Her instincts screamed that this was risky, but she couldn't let him walk away again. Nodding, she followed him out of the restaurant and into the alley behind it. The alley was quiet, the dim glow of a single streetlight casting long shadows on the brick walls. Michael stopped a few steps ahead of her and turned, his face unreadable. "Talk," Emily demanded. "No more warnings. No more cryptic messages. Just tell me the truth." Michael crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "The truth is dangerous, Emily. You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then help me understand," she snapped. "You left me, Michael. You let me think you were dead. Do you know what that did to me? To Ethan." At the mention of their son, Michael's mask of composure cracked. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I did it to protect you." "From what?" Emily pressed. "From Moretti, from whoever those men were at the crash site." Michael's head snapped back toward her, his eyes narrowing. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been digging," Emily said, her voice trembling with anger. "I spoke to Richard Caldwell. He saw everything that night. He saw you being pulled from the wreckage. So don't you dare stand there and act like you're the victim." Michael stared at her for a long moment, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured. "I thought I could leave it all behind." Start over," Emily repeated, her voice rising. "You mean abandoning your family and letting us think you were gone forever?" "I didn't have a choice," Michael said, his voice finally breaking. "Do you think I wanted this? To leave you and Ethan? To let you bury me? I was in too deep." "Emily, Moretti doesn't let people walk away. If I hadn't disappeared, you and Ethan would have been next." Emily's breath caught. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was lying. But deep down, she saw the truth in his eyes. He believed every word he was saying. "What did you do for him?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What could have been so bad that you thought faking your death was the only way out?" Michael hesitated, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I handled money for him, cleaned it, moved it, made it disappear. And when I found out what it was funding, what kind of things he was doing, I tried to leave. That's when the threats started." Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. "So you ran?" Michael nodded. "I had to. The crash. It was staged, my way out. But it didn't work. Moretti found me. And now, he knows you're digging. That's why I've been warning you. He'll come after you, Emily." Emily took a shaky breath, her anger fading into fear. "Then help me stop him. Tell me how to protect Ethan." Michael shook his head. "The only way to protect him is to walk away. Leave this alone. Let Moretti think you're done." "I can't do that," Emily said firmly. "Not until I know the full truth. Not until I know you're safe." Michael looked at her, a mixture of frustration and admiration in his eyes. "You're braver than I ever was," he said softly, "but you're putting yourself in danger." "I don't care," Emily said. "I'm not losing you again." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden noise, a car engine revving nearby, made them both freeze. Michael's expression darkened. "We need to go, now. He grabbed her hand, pulling her out of the alley and into the shadows of the nearby streets. Emily's heart raced, the weight of his words and the urgency of their situation pressing down on her. Emily followed Michael through the darkened streets, her heart pounding in her chest. His grip on her hand was firm, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. The sound of a car engine idling nearby sent a shiver down her spine. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every noise a potential danger. "Where are we going?" Emily whispered as they turned a corner. "Somewhere safe," Michael replied tersely. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the street behind them. For now, they ducked into an old parking garage, the fluorescent lights above flickering ominously. Michael led her to a secluded corner on the top floor, where they were shielded from view but could see anyone approaching. He finally released her hand, leaning against a concrete pillar and running a hand through his hair. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, his voice low but laced with frustration. Emily crossed her arms, her anger bubbling to the surface. "Don't you dare blame me for this. I wouldn't have to follow you if you hadn't disappeared in the first place." Michael sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know, but now you're involved, and that puts you and Ethan in danger. Moretti doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget." Emily took a step closer, her voice firm. "Then tell me everything. Stop giving me half-truths and warnings. I need to know what we're up against." Michael hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. For a moment, Emily thought he might brush her off again, but then he looked up, his expression grim. "Moretti runs a criminal empire," he began. "Drugs, weapons, trafficking, you name it. He's involved. I worked for one of his shell companies, Prometheus Logistics on the surface. It was a legitimate operation, but behind the scenes I was laundering millions of dollars for him." Emily's stomach turned. "And you didn't know?" "Not at first," Michael said, shaking his head. "I thought I was just managing accounts, but the deeper I got, the more I realized what was really going on. When I tried to leave, Moretti sent a message, one I couldn't ignore." "What kind of message?" Emily asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Michael's jaw tightened. "He sent people after me. They broke into our house while you and Ethan were out, left a note on the counter. It said, 'Stay, or they'll pay.' That's when I knew I couldn't just walk away." Emily felt a chill run through her. The thought of someone threatening her family, even years ago, made her blood boil. "So you faked your death?" Michael nodded. "It was the only way I could think to protect you. I thought if Moretti believed I was dead, he'd leave you alone, and for a while it worked. But then you started digging, and now he knows you're connected to me." Emily sat on the edge of a low concrete barrier, her mind racing. Everything Michael was saying made sense, but it also left her with more questions than answers. "If he knows about me, why hasn't he come after us yet?" "He's watching," Michael said grimly. "That's what he does. He waits, gathers information, figures out how to use it against you, the man who came to your door. He's one of Moretti's guys. That was your warning." Emily clenched her fists. "Then what do we do? I'm not going to sit around and wait for him to strike." Michael hesitated, his eyes flicking to the shadows around them. "I have a plan, but it's risky, and I can't do it alone." "Tell me," Emily said, determination hardening her voice. Michael glanced at her, as if weighing whether to trust her fully. Finally, he nodded. "Moretti keeps records. Blackmail material. Financial ledgers, deals, everything he needs to control his empire. If we can get our hands on those records, we can expose him, take him down." "Where are these records?" Emily asked. Michael hesitated. "In his private vault. It's in a compound just outside the city, heavily guarded." Emily felt her heart sink. "And you think we can just walk in there and take them?" "No," Michael admitted. "But I know someone who can help." Later that night, Emily returned to her apartment, her nerves frayed and her mind spinning with Michael's revelations. She locked the door behind her, double-checking the windows before peeking in on Ethan. He was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him, a mixture of fear and resolve swirling inside her. She didn't want to put him at risk, but she also couldn't ignore the threat looming over them. If taking down Moretti was the only way to keep her son safe, then she would do whatever it took. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and she snatched it up, expecting another warning or threat. Instead, it was a text from Rachel. "Found something you need to see. Call me ASAP." Emily dialed immediately, pacing the kitchen as the call connected. "Rachel," she said. "I've been digging into Moretti," Rachel said, her voice urgent. "And I found something big. There's a name that keeps coming up in connection with him. Paul Radcliffe. He's a former associate who went into hiding years ago. But rumor has it he knows everything about Moretti's operations." "Where is he now?" Emily asked. "That's the problem," Rachel replied. "No one knows for sure, but if you can find him, he might be your best chance." Emily's grip on the phone tightened. Another lead, another risk. But she was too far in to back out now. "Thanks, Rachel. I'll figure it out." As she hung up, Emily glanced back at the closed door of Ethan's room. Whatever lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let Moretti, or anyone else, tear her family apart again. Emily stood in her small kitchen the next morning, sipping a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She stared out the window, her thoughts racing as she replayed everything Michael had told her the night before. A criminal empire, a vault of secrets, and now the name Paul Radcliffe, a man who might hold the key to exposing Moretti. It felt like a web she couldn't untangle, no matter how hard she tried. Ethan's cheerful voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, can we go to the park after school today?" She forced a smile, masking the turmoil inside her. "Maybe, sweetheart. Let's see how the day goes." Ethan accepted the vague answer with a shrug, his mind already on the day ahead. As she dropped him off at school, Emily couldn't shake the lingering fear that they were being watched. Every car parked nearby, every passerby, seemed suspicious. She told herself it was paranoia, but the weight in her chest wouldn't ease. Emily's phone buzzed with a text from Michael as she returned home. "We need to meet. Tonight. Usual spot." Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what he meant by usual spot, but she assumed it was the alley behind L'Exquisite where they'd spoken before. She replied with a simple okay and spent the rest of the day trying to prepare herself for whatever Michael had planned. When night fell, Emily told Rachel she needed someone to watch Ethan for a couple of hours. Rachel didn't ask too many questions, sensing that Emily wasn't ready to share everything yet. "Be careful," Rachel said, as Emily handed Ethan his backpack, packed with snacks and his favorite book. "I will," Emily promised, kissing her son's forehead. "I'll pick you up soon, okay?" Ethan nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Emily arrived at the alley, her heart pounding. Michael was already there, leaning against a wall with his arms crossed. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes darted around the dimly lit street, scanning for threats. "You came," he said simply as she approached. "Of course I did," Emily replied. "What's the plan?" Michael glanced over her shoulder, ensuring they were alone, before pulling out a folded map and spreading it on a nearby crate. "This is Moretti's compound," he said, pointing to a marked spot on the edge of the city. "The vault is here, in the main building. It's heavily guarded. Security cameras, armed men, the works." Emily studied the map, her stomach tightening. "And you think we can get in there?" "We're not doing it alone," Michael said. "Paul Radcliffe knows the layout. He helped design the security system years ago, before he went into hiding. If we find him, he can help us." Emily frowned. "And how do we do that?" Rachel said. "No one knows where he is." Michael smirked faintly. "Rachel's not looking in the right places." He pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page filled with names, addresses, and phone numbers. "I've been keeping tabs on some of Moretti's old associates. One of them owes me a favor. If anyone knows where Radcliffe is, it's him." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And you trust this person?" Michael hesitated. "Not entirely, but he wants out of Moretti's shadow as much as I do. That's enough for now." The next day, Michael and Emily drove to a run-down industrial area on the outskirts of the city. The address Michael had was for a dilapidated warehouse, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. "Stay close," Michael said as they stepped out of the car. "And don't say anything unless I tell you to." Emily nodded, her nerves fraying as they approached the building. Michael knocked on a rusted metal door in a specific rhythm. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. After a tense moment, the door creaked open, revealing a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek. "Dawson," the man said, his tone equal parts surprise and suspicion. Didn't think I'd see you again? Need your help, Eddie? Michael said, his voice steady. I'm looking for Paul Radcliffe. Eddie's eyes flicked to Emily, then back to Michael. Bringing company now. That's bold. She's with me, Michael said firmly. Can you help or not? Eddie hesitated, then stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. The interior was a stark contrast to the exterior. A small, clean office with monitors lining the walls, displaying surveillance feeds of the surrounding area. Eddie sat at a cluttered desk, tapping on a keyboard. Radcliffe's gone quiet, Eddie said, not looking up. Last I heard, he was laying low in a cabin up north, off the grid. No phones, no internet. He's paranoid as hell. Do you have an address? Michael asked. Eddie snorted. I might, but information like that doesn't come cheap. Michael pulled out an envelope and slid it across the desk. Eddie opened it, his eyes scanning the cash inside. Satisfied, he nodded and scribbled something on a piece of paper. Here, Eddie said, handing it to Michael. But be careful. Radcliffe doesn't trust anyone. He's likely to shoot first and ask questions later. Michael pocketed the paper. Thanks, as they left the warehouse. Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of what they were walking into. Finding Paul Radcliffe was only the first step, but it already felt like they were in over their heads. That night, Emily sat on her couch, staring at the address Eddie had given them. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, guarded by a man who didn't trust anyone. It sounded impossible, but it was their only lead. Michael sat across from her, his expression unreadable. You don't have to come, he said. I can handle this. Emily shook her head. I'm already in this, Michael. We do this together. Michael looked at her for a long moment before nodding. We leave tomorrow. The early morning air was crisp as Emily and Michael loaded a few supplies into the trunk of his car. The address Eddie had provided led to a remote area far from the city. Dense woods and winding roads, the kind of place people went to disappear. Emily hugged her jacket closer to her body, her nerves on edge. This was uncharted territory, both literally and figuratively, as they drove out of the city. The urban sprawl gave way to open fields and thick forests. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine. Emily glanced at Michael, his focus fixed on the road. Do you think he'll help us? She asked, breaking the quiet. Michael didn't take his eyes off the road. Radcliffe doesn't help anyone unless it benefits him. But he hates Moretti. That's our leverage. Emily nodded, though her stomach churned. The further they drove, the more isolated the world around them became. She had no idea what to expect when they reached the cabin, or if they'd even find Radcliffe alive. The drive took hours, the narrow roads twisting through dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. By the time they arrived at the coordinates Eddie had given them, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. The cabin was tucked away in a clearing, small and unassuming, with a sagging porch and a chimney that showed no signs of smoke. Michael parked a safe distance away, cutting the engine. They sat in silence for a moment, surveying the scene. Stay behind me, Michael said, opening the car door. Emily followed him cautiously as they approached the cabin. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the wooden steps underfoot making her heart race. Michael knocked on the door firmly, his other hand resting on the pocket where Emily knew he kept a small knife. There was no answer. Michael knocked again, louder this time. Paul, it's Michael Dawson. I need to talk to you. Still nothing. Emily exchanged a nervous glance with him. Just as Michael was about to knock again, a voice rang out from the woods behind them. That's close enough. They froze. Emily turned slowly, her breath catching at the sight of a man standing about 20 feet away. A rifle trained on them. He was tall and wiry, his face weathered but alert, his piercing eyes locked onto Michael. Radcliffe, Michael said evenly, raising his hand slightly. We're not here to cause trouble. That's what everyone says, Radcliffe replied, his voice rough, but trouble always follows. Emily's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of the rifle's aim, its cold precision ready to end them if Radcliffe so much as twitched. Moretti sent you, didn't he? Radcliffe asked, taking a step closer. Figured he'd try to clean up loose ends. No, Michael said quickly. This has nothing to do with him. I need your help. It's about the vault. Radcliffe's eyes narrowed. The vault. That's a death wish. Maybe, Michael admitted, but it's the only way to take him down. Radcliffe stared at them for what felt like an eternity before finally lowering the rifle. Inside, both of you. Slowly. Michael nodded, motioning for Emily to follow him. Radcliffe kept the gun at his side but didn't let his guard down as they stepped into the cabin. The interior was cluttered but functional, a mix of survival gear and technology, maps pinned to the walls, a laptop on a rickety table, and shelves stocked with canned goods and ammunition. Talk, Radcliffe said, leaning against the table. Why should I stick my neck out for you? Michael glanced at Emily, then back at Radcliffe. Because you know what Moretti is capable of. He's got dirt on everyone, you included. If we get the vault, we can destroy him, and all his leverage. Radcliffe barked a humorless laugh. You think it's that simple? That vault isn't just a safe. It's a fortress. Cameras, guards, biometric locks. And if you somehow manage to break in, you'll still have to get out alive. We don't have a choice, Emily interjected, her voice firm. Radcliffe's sharp gaze shifted to her, and she felt a wave of nervous energy. Moretti already knows about me, about my son. If we don't stop him, he'll come for us. Radcliffe studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, shaking his head. You're either brave or stupid. Maybe both. Emily's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. Will you help us or not? Radcliffe rubbed a hand over his face, muttering something under his breath. Finally, he turned to Michael. You're lucky I hate that bastard more than I value my peace. Fine, I'll help. But if this goes south, you're on your own. Michael nodded, relief flickering across his face. That's all we need. The rest of the evening was spent poring over maps and schematics that Radcliffe pulled from an old lockbox. He explained the security measures in detail, pointing out weak spots and potential escape routes. Emily listened intently, her anxiety giving way to determination. For the first time, she felt like they had a real shot at this. Remember, Radcliffe warned as they packed up the plans, this isn't just about getting in. Once you're inside, you'll have minutes, if that, to find what you need and get out. Anything longer, and you're dead. Emily swallowed hard, but nodded. We'll be ready. As they left the cabin under cover of darkness, Emily felt a strange mix of hope and dread. They had a plan, but it was fragile at best. One misstep, one mistake, and everything they were fighting for could come crashing down. Michael glanced at her as they climbed into the car. You okay? No, Emily admitted. But I'm not backing out. Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Good, because we're just getting started. Emily woke the next morning to the sharp sound of her alarm, but her body felt heavy, her mind weighed down by the enormity of what lay ahead. The meeting with Paul Radcliffe had made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't just a theory or an idea anymore. It was a dangerous, high-stakes plan that could cost her everything if they failed. But the alternative, doing nothing, wasn't an option. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the map Radcliffe had given them. Her thoughts were interrupted by Ethan's small voice as he padded into the room, clutching his stuffed bear. Mom, why are you up so early? He asked, his sleepy eyes narrowing as he noticed the papers spread across the table. What's all that? Emily quickly shuffled the map out of sight, forcing a smile. Just some work stuff, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about. Ethan frowned but didn't push. Can we have pancakes? Emily ruffled his hair. Sure thing, buddy. As she made breakfast, she found herself clinging to the routine. The normalcy of flipping pancakes and listening to Ethan chatter about his day ahead. It grounded her, reminded her of what she was fighting for. She kissed him on the forehead as she dropped him off at school, silently promising herself that she would do whatever it took to protect him. Back at home, Emily met Michael, who had spent the night finalizing their plans. He was already at the kitchen table, spreading out blueprints and notes across the surface. His sharp focus made him look like a man she didn't fully recognize. Determined, calculating, and somehow even more distant than before. Radcliffe sent me the codes for the outer perimeter, Michael said without looking up. They'll get us past the first line of security, but once we're inside, it's on us. Emily nodded, taking a seat across from him. What about the guards? Cameras, Michael pointed to a section of the blueprint. Radcliffe marked the blind spots here and here. If we time it right, we can move through the hallways without being seen. But the guards patrol in shifts, so we'll have to be fast. Emily studied the map, her stomach twisting. And the vault itself. How do we get in? Michael hesitated before pulling out a small device from his bag. It looked like a flash drive, but bulkier, with wires and tiny circuits exposed. Radcliffe built this. It'll override the biometric lock on the vault door. It's not foolproof, but it should give us enough time. Should, Emily repeated, her voice tinged with concern. Michael met her gaze. Nothing about this is certain, Emily. It's a long shot, but it's all we've got. Emily nodded, swallowing her fear. Then we make it work. The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. They rehearsed the plan over and over, walking through each step until Emily could visualize every movement in her mind. Michael drilled her on timing, escape routes, and contingencies, his tone growing sharper with each mistake she made. "We can't afford errors," he said, after she tripped over one of the steps in their mock run. "One slip, and we're done." "I get it," Emily snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "But I'm not you, Michael. I don't have years of experience in whatever this is." Michael softened slightly, his expression almost apologetic. "I know, I'm sorry, I need you to be ready." Emily exhaled, her anger fading. "I am ready. We're doing this together, remember?" Michael nodded, but the tension in his shoulders remained. That evening, they met with Radcliffe one last time in a secluded spot just outside the city. The old man handed Michael a bag filled with tools and equipment, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened parking lot for signs of trouble. "Once you're inside," Radcliffe said, "don't waste time. The longer you're in there, the higher the chances Moretti's guys will catch on. And if they do—" "We know," Michael interrupted, his tone firm. "We'll move fast." Radcliffe eyed Emily. "You sure about this?" Emily met his gaze, her voice steady. "Yes." Radcliffe shrugged. "Your funeral." He handed Michael a second envelope, this one containing a burner phone. "Call me when it's done and don't screw this up." Back at the apartment, Emily sat on the couch, staring at the tools they'd laid out on the coffee table. A wave of doubt crept over her. She wasn't a criminal or a spy. She was a mother, a waitress, a woman trying to survive. What made her think she could pull off something like this? Michael sat down beside her, sensing her unease. "You're thinking about backing out?" "No," Emily said quickly. I'm scared." Michael nodded, his gaze softening. "You should be. Fear keeps you sharp, but you're not doing this alone. I won't let anything happen to you." Emily looked at him, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the man who'd made her feel safe, even when the world was falling apart. "Promise me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me we'll make it back." Michael hesitated, then reached for her hand. "I promise." That night, as Emily lay in bed, her mind refused to rest. Every scenario played out in her head. What could go wrong? What might happen if they failed? But as she closed her eyes, one image stood out. Ethan, smiling as he scored a goal at his soccer game. That was her anchor, her reason to push through the fear. Tomorrow, everything would change, and no matter the outcome, she was ready to fight for her family. The night was cold and silent as Emily and Michael crouched in the shadows outside Moretti's compound. The sprawling estate loomed before them, surrounded by tall fences and patrolled by armed guards. The glow of security lights cut through the darkness, casting sharp shadows across the gravel paths. Emily's heart raced as she adjusted the straps of the small backpack she carried, which held the tools Radcliffe had given them. She could feel the weight of Michael's gaze as he scanned the perimeter, his jaw tight with concentration. "Remember," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling trees. "Stick to the plan, stay close to me, and move when I tell you." Emily nodded, gripping the straps of her backpack tightly. Her palms were sweaty, her nerves frayed, but she forced herself to focus. There was no room for fear now. They had come too far to turn back. Michael pressed a button on his phone, and the screen lit up with a live feed from the compound's security cameras. Radcliffe's device had worked as promised, temporarily looping the footage to give them a window of opportunity. "Now," Michael said, gesturing for Emily to follow him. They slipped through a gap in the fence, the sharp edges of the metal scraping against their clothes. The compound's manicured gardens stretched out before them, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated nature of what lay inside. Emily stayed low, her breathing shallow as they darted between hedges and statues, avoiding the guard's line of sight. As they reached the side entrance, Michael pulled out a small device from his pocket, a signal jammer Radcliffe had given them. He activated it, and the faint hum of security cameras nearby abruptly stopped. "We have 10 minutes before they reset," Michael whispered, pulling a lock-picking kit from his bag. He worked quickly, his fingers steady despite the tension in the air. Within seconds, the door clicked open. Emily followed him inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and expensive leather, a quiet reminder of the wealth and power Moretti wielded. Michael motioned for her to stay close as they moved down the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. The vault was located in the heart of the compound, hidden behind a nondescript door that blended seamlessly with the walls. Michael knelt in front of the biometric lock, pulling out the override device Radcliffe had built. "This should take about 3 minutes," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Watch the hallway." Emily nodded, positioning herself near the corner. Her pulse quickened with every second that passed, her ears straining for any sound of approaching footsteps. Michael worked in silence, his focus unshakable as he connected the device to the lock. A faint beep signaled progress, but the tension in the air was suffocating. "Come on," Michael muttered under his breath, his fingers flying over the device's controls. Suddenly, a noise echoed down the hallway, a faint but distinct shuffle of boots on the carpet. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she turned to Michael. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently. Michael didn't look up. "I need another 30 seconds. Stall them." Panic surged through Emily, but she forced herself to stay calm. She grabbed a small decorative vase from a nearby table and hurled it down the opposite hallway. The crash was deafening, and the footsteps immediately quickened in that direction. Michael glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting hers. "Good thinking." The device beeped again, and the lock clicked open. Michael pushed the door wide, revealing the vault, a gleaming steel room lined with shelves and filing cabinets. Emily followed him inside, her eyes widening at the sheer amount of information stored within. "Start looking for anything with Moretti's name on it," Michael instructed, pulling open a drawer. Financial records, blackmail files, anything. Emily began rifling through the cabinets, her hands shaking as she flipped through folders. The weight of what they were doing pressed heavily on her. Every second spent in the vault felt like an eternity, the risk of being caught looming over them. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, Michael let out a triumphant noise. "Got it," he said, holding up a thick folder labeled "Sensitive." "Confidential." Emily grabbed a flash drive from one of the drawers, slipping it into her pocket. "This might have backups," she said. Michael nodded. "Let's move." They exited the vault quickly, Michael relocking the door behind them to buy some time. The hallway was eerily quiet, but Emily's instincts screamed that their luck wouldn't hold for long. As they approached the side entrance, a guard rounded the corner. He froze for a split second before his hand went to the radio on his shoulder. "Stop!" Michael barked, lunging forward. He slammed the guard against the wall, knocking the radio from his grasp. The struggle was brief but intense, and Emily watched in shock as Michael subdued the man, leaving him unconscious on the floor. "Let's go," Michael said, his voice cold and steady. Emily followed him out into the night, her legs trembling as they retraced their path through the gardens. The adrenaline coursing through her made everything feel surreal. The shadows seemed sharper, the sounds more vivid. They slipped through the fence just as the distant sound of alarms began to wail. Emily's heart pounded as they ran toward the car, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Michael threw the bag into the back seat and started the engine. "We're clear, for now," as the car sped away from the compound. Emily glanced back at the receding lights, her hands still trembling. They had done it. Against all odds, they had infiltrated Moretti's compound and retrieved the evidence they needed. But the victory felt hollow. The weight of what came next pressed heavily on her. This was only the beginning. Moretti wouldn't let this go unanswered, and Emily knew they were far from safe. The car's interior was eerily silent as Michael drove through the dark, winding roads leading back to the city. The folder filled with incriminating evidence sat on Emily's lap, the weight of its contents seeming heavier than the paper it contained. She stared down at it, her thoughts racing. They had done what seemed impossible, but the victory didn't feel sweet. "You okay?" Michael asked, his eyes flicking toward her briefly. Emily nodded, though her hands trembled as she clutched the folder. I can't believe we actually did it." Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't celebrate yet. Moretti's not the type to let something like this slide. He'll know it was us." The reminder sent a chill down Emily's spine. She glanced over her shoulder at the empty road behind them, half expecting headlights to appear in the distance. "What happens now?" Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We hand this over to someone who can use it. The authorities, a journalist, anyone who can expose him publicly." Emily frowned. "And you think that'll stop him?" "No," Michael admitted, "but it'll weaken him if his network falls apart. If the people who rely on him start to turn on him, he'll have fewer resources to come after us." The plan made sense, but it didn't ease Emily's anxiety. They had poked a hornet's nest, and the sting was inevitable. By the time they reached the city, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and gray. Michael parked the car in a secluded lot, pulling a burner phone from his bag. He dialed a number and stepped out to make the call, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts. She opened the folder. Flipping through the pages, bank statements, offshore account details, coded transactions, it was all there. A damning paper trail linking Moretti to countless crimes. But what caught her attention most was a series of photos clipped to the back of one report. They were surveillance images of people, some in suits, others in uniforms, all of them looking powerful and untouchable. Emily's stomach twisted as she recognized one of the faces. It was Victor Moretti himself, shaking hands with a high-ranking police official. The implications were clear. Moretti had friends in all the right places, even if they exposed him. How could they trust anyone to act on it? Michael climbed back into the car, snapping her out of her thoughts. Radcliffe's setting up a meeting with a journalist he trusts, someone outside the system. Emily hesitated, holding up the photos. "Michael, look at this. Moretti's got people on the inside. Police, government officials. Even if we go public, how do we know it'll be enough?" Michael stared at the images, his jaw tightening. "We don't. But we don't have a choice." They drove to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript apartment Radcliffe had secured for them. Inside, the curtains were drawn tight, and the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and dust. Radcliffe was already there, seated at a cluttered table with a laptop open in front of him. "You're late," Radcliffe said, his tone sharp but not unkind. "We had to make sure we weren't followed," Michael replied, dropping the folder onto the table. Radcliffe opened it, flipping through the pages quickly. He let out a low whistle. "This is good. Better than I expected. If this gets out, Moretti's empire crumbles." Emily crossed her arms. "But does it get out? Or do his friends in high places bury it before it can do any damage?" Radcliffe smirked, typing rapidly on his laptop. "That's why we're not going through official channels. The journalist I contacted works for an independent outlet. She's got nothing to lose and everything to gain by taking Moretti down." Michael nodded. "How long until the meeting?" "Tonight," Radcliffe replied. "But until then, you two need to lay low. Moretti's going to figure out what happened, and when he does, he'll come looking." Emily glanced at Michael, unease settling in her chest. "What if he finds us first?" Radcliffe's expression darkened. "Then you better hope you're ready to fight." The hours dragged on as they waited for nightfall. Emily paced the small apartment, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. Michael sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the street below, watching for any signs of trouble. Radcliffe remained glued to his laptop, typing furiously as he prepared the files for the journalist. Emily finally broke the silence. "Do you really think this will work? That exposing him will be enough?" Michael turned to her, his expression softening. "I don't know, but it's a start." Radcliffe snorted. "It's more than a start. This kind of exposure ruins people like Moretti. Once his allies see him as a liability, they'll cut ties to save themselves." Emily wanted to believe them, but doubt lingered. Moretti had proven time and time again that he was always one step ahead. What if this time was no different? As night fell, they prepared to leave for the meeting. Michael checked the bag containing the evidence one last time, ensuring everything was in place. Emily tucked the flash drive into her pocket, her hand lingering on it as if it were a lifeline. Radcliffe handed Michael a second burner phone. "If anything goes wrong, call me. I've got backup plans." "What kind of backup plans?" Emily asked. Radcliffe smirked. "The kind that make problems disappear." The comment did little to reassure her, but she nodded, her focus shifting to the task ahead. This was their chance to strike back, to finally take control of the situation. But as they stepped out into the cool night air, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the fallout from their actions was just beginning. The dark alley behind the old warehouse smelled of damp concrete and decay, a fitting backdrop for the tension coiling in Emily's chest. She stood with Michael, the evidence bag in his hand, as they waited for Radcliffe's contact to arrive. The journalist, Claire Hammond, was someone Radcliffe swore could be trusted, but the stakes had never felt higher. Michael glanced at his watch, his jaw tight. "She should be here by now." "She'll come," Radcliffe said, leaning against a wall and lighting a cigarette. The glow from the lighter briefly illuminated his sharp features, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside Emily. "What if this is a trap?" Emily asked. "Emily," her voice low but insistent. "It's not," Radcliffe replied, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Claire's the real deal. She's broken stories that made enemies of people just as dangerous as Moretti. That's supposed to make me feel better," Emily muttered, scanning the shadows nervously before Radcliffe could respond. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the alley. Michael straightened, his grip tightening on the bag as a figure emerged from the darkness. Claire Hammond was tall and composed, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. She wore a trench coat and carried a satchel slung over one shoulder, her eyes sharp and assessing as they swept over the group. "Michael Dawson," she said, extending a hand to him. "Radcliffe told me about you." Michael shook her hand, his expression unreadable. "And you're sure we can trust you?" Claire smirked. "If I wanted to double-cross you, I wouldn't have come alone." She gestured to the satchel. "Let me see what you've got." Michael hesitated for a moment before handing her the bag. Claire opened it, flipping through the documents inside with practiced efficiency. Her expression grew more serious with each page, and she whistled softly. "This is explosive," she said. "Moretti's entire network is in here. Names, transactions, everything. If this goes public, it'll ruin him." "That's the idea," Michael said. Claire looked up, her gaze piercing. "You know what happens next, right? Once this gets out, Moretti's going to know exactly who did it. He'll come after you with everything he's got." Emily stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "He already knows we're involved. We're not safe whether we expose him or not. At least this way, we have a chance to fight back." Claire studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. I'll take this to my editor. We'll get the story ready to publish by tomorrow morning." Radcliffe, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. "Make sure you're careful with it. Moretti's got eyes everywhere." Claire's smirk returned. "I didn't survive this long by being careless." As Claire disappeared into the night with the evidence, Emily felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it felt like they had a real chance of bringing Moretti down. But the moment was short-lived. Michael's phone buzzed, and his face darkened as he read the message. "What is it?" Emily asked, her stomach sinking. "They know," Michael said, his voice tight. "Moretti's men are on the move, Radcliffe. We need to get out of here." Radcliffe crushed his cigarette under his boot, his demeanor shifting instantly. "Where's your car?" "Parked 2 blocks over," Michael replied. "Not anymore," Radcliffe said, nodding toward the alley's entrance. A black SUV sat idling there, its headlights cutting through the shadows. "Run," Michael barked, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her down the alley. Radcliffe followed, his movements surprisingly agile for a man of his age. They darted through narrow streets and back alleys, the sound of tires screeching and voices shouting behind them. Emily's lungs burned as they sprinted, her mind racing with panic. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of armed men spilling out of the SUV. They were gaining on them. "This way," Radcliffe shouted, veering toward an abandoned building with shattered windows and a crumbling facade. Michael and Emily followed, slipping inside just as a burst of gunfire echoed through the night. The building was a labyrinth of debris and shadows. Radcliffe led them through the maze of broken walls and exposed beams. His movements quick and deliberate. They climbed a staircase that groaned under their weight, finally reaching a small room on the top floor. Radcliffe pulled a gun from his jacket, his expression grim. "They won't stop until they find us. We hold them off here." Michael nodded, pulling out a knife he'd tucked into his boot. "Emily, stay back." "Like hell I will," she snapped, grabbing a rusted pipe from the floor. Her hands trembled, but her grip was firm. "I'm not just going to stand here while they hunt us." Michael's expression softened for a moment, but before he could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the building. The men were closing in. The next few minutes were chaos. The first man through the doorway was met with a swift punch from Michael, who disarmed him and sent him crashing into the wall. Radcliffe fired a warning shot, forcing the others to take cover. Emily swung her pipe at a second attacker, the force of the impact reverberating through her arms. "Fall back!" Radcliffe shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. They moved deeper into the building, using the narrow hallways to their advantage, but it was clear the odds weren't in their favor. The men were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. As they reached a dead end, Michael turned to Emily, his face pale but determined. "You have to go." "What?" she exclaimed, her heart sinking. "I'm not leaving you. You have to," Michael insisted, shoving a piece of paper into her hands. "This is a safe house address. Take Ethan and go. I'll hold them off." Tears stung Emily's eyes, but before she could argue, Michael kissed her forehead. "Go, Emily, please." Radcliffe grabbed her arm, pulling her away as Michael turned to face the approaching men. Her heart shattered as she was dragged out of the building, the sound of gunfire and shouts fading behind her. The cold night air hit Emily like a wall as she stumbled out of the building with Radcliffe. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead, but the pounding of her heart drowned out everything else. Behind her, the muffled sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. Michael was still inside, fighting to buy them time. "This way," Radcliffe barked, tugging her arm and leading her through a narrow alley that opened into an overgrown lot. The moonlight illuminated their path, but it did little to ease the growing dread in Emily's chest. "I can't leave him," she shouted, jerking her arm free. Her voice cracked, the words filled with desperation. "We have to go back." Radcliffe whirled on her, his expression hard but not unkind. "If we go back now, we die." Michael knew that, and he made his choice. "You need to focus on what's ahead. On Ethan. That's what he's fighting for." Emily's throat tightened, her mind warring between logic and emotion. She hated how much sense Radcliffe's words made. Her son needed her alive. Michael had made his decision. But it didn't make leaving him any easier. Radcliffe softened slightly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I've seen men like Moretti destroy lives over less. You want to honor Michael? Stay alive and take Moretti down." Emily swallowed hard, her tears spilling silently down her cheeks with a shaky nod. She followed Radcliffe into the night. The safe house Michael had directed them to was a small, nondescript apartment tucked away in a forgotten part of the city. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Emily barely registered her surroundings as she sank onto the worn couch. Clutching the piece of paper Michael had given her, Radcliffe bolted the door and checked the locks twice before joining her in the living room. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, and watched her carefully. "You did good back there," he said after a long silence. "Most people would have frozen up." Emily let out a bitter laugh, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "Good. I left him behind. That's not good. It's cowardice." Radcliffe shook his head. "It's survival. Michael's no fool. He knows what he's doing, and he'd never forgive himself if you didn't make it out." Emily didn't respond. She couldn't. The guilt clawed at her, an unbearable weight that made it hard to breathe. Hours passed in tense silence. Emily sat by the window, staring out at the empty street. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a message from Rachel. "Ethan's asleep. Are you okay?" Her hands trembled as she typed back. "I'm safe. I'll explain everything soon. Thank you for watching him." She put the phone down, her thoughts drifting to her son. Ethan had no idea what was happening, no idea that his world was on the brink of chaos. She needed to see him, to hold him and tell him everything would be okay, even if she wasn't sure it was true. Radcliffe's voice broke through her thoughts. We'll need to move again soon. Moretti's men will be looking for us. Emily turned to him, her expression hardening. I'm not going anywhere until I know Michael's okay. Radcliffe sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. If he made it out, he'll contact us. But you need to be prepared for the possibility that he didn't. No, Emily said firmly, her voice shaking but resolute. He's alive, I know he is. Radcliffe didn't argue, but his silence was heavy with doubt. As dawn broke, Emily's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. Her heart leapt as she answered, her voice trembling. Hello. There was a pause before Michael's voice came through, low and strained. Emily, it's me. Relief flooded her body and she nearly collapsed against the wall. Michael, are you okay? Where are you? I'm fine, he said, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. I got out. But they're still looking for me. I can't stay in one place for long. Come to us, Emily pleaded. We're at the safe house. No, Michael said quickly. If I come to you, I'll lead them right to you. I need to draw them away. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she gripped the phone tightly. Michael, please. We can figure this out together. His voice softened. Emily, you're stronger than you think. You don't need me to protect you anymore. Just keep Ethan safe. That's all that matters. The line went dead before she could respond. Emily stared at the phone, her chest heaving as she fought back sobs. Radcliffe approached her cautiously. Was it him? She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. He's alive, but he's still running. Radcliffe placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we focus on the next step. Claire's got the evidence, and if she does her job, Moretti's empire will start to crumble. Emily wiped her face, her resolve hardening. And what happens when Moretti finds out it was us? Radcliffe smirked, his eyes glinting with something dangerous. Then we make sure he regrets it. As the day wore on, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Michael was alive, but he was out there alone, hunted by a man who wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. She couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. She sat down at the table with Radcliffe, her voice steady. What's our next move? Radcliffe pulled out a map and laid it between them. We cut off Moretti's resources one by one. We take the fight to him. Emily nodded, determination burning in her chest. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back. Emily woke to the sound of rustling papers and the faint clink of coffee cups. The safe house was quiet except for Radcliffe, who was already at the table, poring over maps and documents. She rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion of the past few days pressing down on her. But there was no time for rest, not with Michael still on the run and Moretti's shadow looming over them. Morning, Radcliffe said without looking up. I've been going through the intel Claire sent after her first article went live. Moretti's network is unraveling, but it's slow. He's still got enough power to make a move. Emily pulled a chair to the table, her mind sharpening as she scanned the map in front of her. What's his next move? Radcliffe tapped a point on the map, a warehouse near the docks. Word is he's consolidating his assets there, moving cash, weapons, whatever he's got left that he can't afford to lose. If we hit it, we can cripple him. Emily frowned. We can't just walk in there. It'll be swarming with his men. Radcliffe smirked. That's why we're not walking in. We're going to hit him where it hurts without giving him the chance to fight back. Later that afternoon, Claire called with an update. The first article exposing Moretti's criminal empire had gained traction, sparking public outrage and putting pressure on the authorities to act. But Emily knew it wasn't enough. Moretti had survived worse, and until they dismantled his operation completely, he would remain a threat. Be careful, Claire warned over the phone. Moretti's desperate now, and desperate men are dangerous. Emily hung up, the weight of Claire's words settling heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at Radcliffe, who was packing a bag with equipment. What's the plan? We're going to sabotage his operation at the docks, Radcliffe said, his voice calm and focused. Michael said he'd draw attention away from us, so we use that distraction to move in. This won't end him, but it'll knock him down a few more pegs. Emily nodded, her jaw tightening. Let's do it. The sun had long set by the time they arrived at the docks. The area was quiet, the faint hum of machinery and the lapping of water against the piers the only sounds. Emily and Radcliffe parked a safe distance away. Using the cover of darkness to approach the warehouse, Radcliffe handed Emily a small device. This is a remote detonator. Plant it near the supply trucks. When we're clear, we'll set it off." Emily took the device, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She followed Radcliffe as they slipped through the shadows. Their footsteps silent on the gravel. They reached the edge of the warehouse, peering through a broken window. Inside, a small group of men moved crates and loaded them onto trucks. Moretti wasn't there, but his presence was felt in the tension that hung in the air. "We'll split up," Radcliffe whispered. "You plant the detonator on the far truck. I'll handle the rest." Emily nodded, slipping into the building through a side door. Her heart pounded as she crouched behind stacks of crates, moving carefully to avoid being seen. The truck loomed ahead, its rear doors open to reveal boxes of weapons and cash. She slid beneath the truck, attaching the detonator to the underside. The click of the adhesive was deafening in the quiet, but no one seemed to notice. She crawled out, her breath coming in short bursts as she retreated to the shadows. Radcliffe's signal came moments later, a faint whistle from the other side of the building. Emily moved quickly to meet him, but as she rounded a corner, she froze. One of Moretti's men was standing in her path, his gun raised. "Don't move," he growled. Emily's mind raced. She raised her hands slowly, her eyes darting to the crates nearby. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice calm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Too late for that," the man sneered, stepping closer. Before he could react, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse as Radcliffe knocked over a stack of crates. The distraction was enough. Emily grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung it, striking the man's arm and sending his gun clattering to the floor. "Go!" Radcliffe shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the exit. The two of them sprinted through the warehouse as shouts erupted behind them. They burst into the night air, ducking behind a stack of shipping containers as gunfire rang out. "Are the charges set?" Radcliffe asked, his voice sharp. Emily nodded, clutching the detonator. "Ready when you are." Radcliffe peeked around the corner, his expression grim. "Do it." Emily pressed the button, and the night exploded in a fiery burst. The warehouse shook as flames engulfed the trucks, the force of the blast knocking them off their feet. She covered her head as debris rained down, the chaos drowning out the shouts of Moretti's men. When the dust settled, the warehouse was ablaze, the supply trucks reduced to twisted metal. Radcliffe helped Emily to her feet, his face smudged with soot but triumphant. "That'll send a message." Back at the safe house, Emily collapsed onto the couch, her body aching and her mind spinning. The warehouse was destroyed, but the fight was far from over. Moretti would retaliate, and they needed to be ready. Michael's voice echoed in her mind. "You're stronger than you think." She clung to those words, drawing strength from them as she prepared for whatever came next. Radcliffe sat beside her, his expression unreadable. "You did good tonight." Emily looked at him, her determination unwavering. "We're not done yet." "No," Radcliffe agreed, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "But we're getting closer." Emily leaned back, her resolve hardening. Moretti's empire was crumbling, piece by piece, and she wouldn't stop until it was gone.